It was nearly midnight when Riley Marsh first noticed the light in the abandoned house across the street. She'd just returned from a late shift at the diner, still in her faded apron, her hair smelling faintly of grease and coffee. Birchwood Lane was quiet at that hour, too quiet, the kind of suburban stillness that felt unnatural, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The house in question, number 46, had been empty for nearly a decade after the Hendersons moved out abruptly one winter night. No one knew exactly why. Some said it was black mold. Others whispered about screams that only came after dark at first. Riley thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. The faint glow behind the second-floor curtains flickered softly, too steady for lightning, too erratic for a lamp. She stood by her kitchen window, frozen in that uneasy middle ground between curiosity and fear. Her old cat, Murphy, brushed against her leg and let out a low, uneasy growl, the kind that made her stomach knot. She turned off her own light to see better, squinting across the street. There it was again, a pale yellow shimmer, like someone walking through the upstairs hallway with a candle. She should have gone to bed. She knew that. Instead, Riley found herself reaching for her phone, snapping a quick photo through the glass. The image came out murky, distorted by the grime on her window, but the light was definitely there. And now she could see something else. A shape. A silhouette standing at the far window, motionless. Her thumb hovered over the call button, debating whether to phone the police. But what would she say? "Hi, there's a ghost in the Henderson house." The words sounded ridiculous even in her head. Still, something about that shadow, tall, thin, slightly hunched, set off every alarm bell in her body. She sat down on the couch, leaving the kitchen light off. The silence of the house pressed in on her, broken only by the faint hum of her refrigerator and the ticking of the clock over the mantel. Every minute dragged. Midnight came and went. Then, at exactly 12:17, a sound shattered the quiet, 3 sharp knocks. Not at her door. Across the street. The noise echoed faintly through the night, hollow and deliberate. Riley gripped the edge of the curtain, her breath fogging the glass as she watched. The light in the second-floor window flared brighter, then vanished completely for a long time. She didn't move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her mind cycling through a dozen explanations that didn't make sense. Finally, she grabbed her jacket, pulled on her boots, and stepped outside. The air was cold, metallic, the kind of chill that made her teeth ache. The street was empty. Every house around her was dark, sleeping. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was awake inside number 46. She crossed halfway down the street before stopping. The second-floor curtain had moved again, just slightly, as if someone inside was watching her back. By morning, Riley had convinced herself it was nothing. A trick of light, maybe, or kids sneaking into the old Henderson house for a dare. She even laughed about it over breakfast, half-heartedly, while stirring her coffee long after the sugar had dissolved. But when she glanced out the window, the laughter died in her throat. The curtain in the second-floor window of number 46 was open now, just slightly, as if someone had pulled it back to peek through. It hadn't been open last night. She was sure of it. She stood there too long, staring. So long that Murphy leapt onto the counter, meowing irritably for food, the sound snapping her back to herself. She poured some kibble, trying to shake the image from her head, but every time she blinked, she saw that thin slit of darkness behind the curtain, the suggestion of movement beyond. When she finally left for work, she couldn't help but glance back one last time before locking the door. The curtain had fallen shut again. The diner. Everything felt slightly off. Regulars chatted at the counter, coffee hissed from the machine, but Riley couldn't stop checking the clock, counting the hours until night. Around 2 p.m., her co-worker Marlene noticed. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said, half joking, half concerned. Riley hesitated, then told her about the light, the figure, the knocks. Marlene's smile faltered. "You shouldn't mess with that house," she said quietly. "My cousin grew up on this street. Said the Hendersons moved because their boy started talking to someone who wasn't there. Called her the lady upstairs." Riley laughed, but it came out thin, unconvincing. That evening, she walked home slower than usual, her shoes crunching the brittle leaves scattered across the sidewalk. The house loomed in the distance, its chipped shutters and sagging roofline silhouetted against the orange sky. A few neighborhood kids had spray-painted the fence years ago, crude faces, faded over time, but tonight they almost looked like masks watching her approach. She reached her porch and paused. The upstairs curtain was still open, and this time, she saw it clearly. Someone was standing there, the same silhouette as before. Still, waiting. Riley's breath caught. She stepped back into the shadow of her own porch, pulse racing. Her phone trembled in her hand as she zoomed in with the camera. The photo came out grainy, blurred, but she could see two faint white ovals where eyes should have been. The figure didn't move, even as the light behind it dimmed to nothing. Then, as she lowered her phone, her screen flickered. For a split second, the photo changed. The window appeared closer, the eyes brighter, and behind her reflection, in the glass of her phone, she could swear she saw another shape, standing just over her shoulder. That night, rain began to fall, thin at first, then steadily, soaking the pavement in silver. Riley sat on her couch, lights off, phone in hand. The photo she'd taken earlier still sat on her screen, hauntingly distorted. She'd deleted it twice, and twice it came back, reappearing in her gallery with the same timestamp, 12:17 a.m. Her fingers trembled as she opened it again. This time, she noticed something new. In the reflection of her porch light, barely visible, there was a second figure in the yard. Smaller, closer to her house. A soft noise startled her. A thud, then another, from somewhere near the front door. She turned down the TV volume and listened. The rain had intensified, drumming against the roof like static. Then, clear and sharp through the storm, came 3 knocks. Deliberate, spaced evenly, just like the ones she'd heard the night before, but closer now, at her own door. Riley froze. Her mind scrambled for logic. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a delivery. But when she looked through the peephole, the porch was empty. Only rain. Only dark. She waited, holding her breath, every muscle tight. The knocks came again, softer this time, like fingertips grazing the wood. She backed away slowly, one step at a time, until she was pressed against the wall. Her phone buzzed suddenly, nearly making her scream. The screen lit up with a text from an unknown number. "You saw me." No name. No reply when she called back. Her throat went dry. She set the phone down on the counter and grabbed a kitchen knife, trying to steady her shaking hands. Minutes passed. Then silence. The kind that feels alive. The kind that waits. Riley peered through the window beside the door, searching for movement. A shadow passed across the street, tall, angular, half obscured by rain. The house on Birchwood Lane was completely dark now, but she could sense something there, something aware. She turned to shut the curtain, and that's when she heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the back of the house. Riley moved slowly through the kitchen, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the storm. The back door rattled slightly under each knock, the handle twitching as though someone were testing it. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale, wide-eyed, terrified. Then, just as she reached for her phone to call the police, the knocking stopped. A single drop of water slid down the inside of the glass, from the inside. Her breath hitched, and through the reflection, behind her shoulder, something tall and dark shifted out of sight down the hallway. Riley didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room with every light on, watching the rain fade to mist. The house felt wrong now, heavy, listening. Each creak of the floorboards made her flinch. Each hum of the refrigerator felt intentional. Around 3 a.m., she turned on the TV for noise, cycling through static-filled channels until she landed on one with no picture, just gray fuzz and a faint crackle. The sound filled the silence. It was oddly comforting, almost like company. Then, through the static, a voice whispered her name. She froze. The whisper was faint but unmistakable, her own name, repeated softly, buried under the hiss like a secret. Riley. She leaned forward, volume low, pulse quickening. "Who's there?" she whispered back before she could stop herself. The static shifted, not louder, but deeper, textured like breath. Then came 3 words that made her skin crawl. "Look outside now." For a moment, she couldn't move. Her mouth went dry, her heartbeat deafening. Against every instinct, she turned toward the window. The street outside was empty, silent. The mist clung to the ground like smoke. But then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw a shape in front of the old Henderson house. The same tall figure from before, standing perfectly still at the curb, facing her window. Its outline was clearer now, almost human but not quite right. The shoulders too high, the arms too long. Lightning flashed, and for an instant, she thought she saw its face. Pale, featureless except for those white, hollow eyes. And then it was gone. Riley staggered back, knocking over a lamp. The crash snapped her from the trance, and when she looked again, the street was empty. Just the rain, just the quiet. The TV still hissed softly behind her. She turned to shut it off, but the image had changed. No longer static. The screen now showed a grainy black and white view of her own living room. The same couch, the same broken lamp. And there, in the corner of the image, was movement, something shifting behind. She spun around. Nothing. Just her shadow against the far wall, trembling in the flickering light. The sound from the TV warped suddenly, deepening into a low, mechanical groan that pulsed through the floor. "Don't turn around again," the voice said, this time clear, almost human, almost close. Her stomach dropped. She could feel warmth at the back of her neck, like breath that wasn't hers. She didn't turn. She didn't scream. She just sat perfectly still until sunrise, hands pressed to her ears, whispering to herself that the house was empty, that she was alone. By the next morning, Elise was done pretending everything was fine. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, coffee gone cold beside her, scrolling through property records and old newspaper archives. Marcus had gone quiet, only muttering vague reassurances, but his silence made her more determined. The house on Granger Street had belonged to her mother's side of the family, but nobody had spoken of it for years. Elise vaguely remembered being told that her great-uncle lived here once, a reclusive man with a sharp temper. Beyond that, she knew little. But as she dug deeper, the house began to take on a story far darker than anything she expected. In the archives, she found an article from 1978. Local man missing. Neighbors report strange noises. The man's name was Harold Fry, her great-uncle. The article described him as volatile and paranoid, claiming he rarely left the property. Neighbors told police they heard hammering at odd hours, dragging sounds, and the muffled cries of what they thought were animals. When Harold vanished, no trace was ever found. The house was left empty until Elise's cousin inherited it decades later. Elise leaned back in her chair, shivering. The words dragging sounds echoed too closely to what she and Marcus had heard. When Marcus came into the kitchen, Elise slid the laptop toward him. He read the article in silence, his face pale. "So he just disappeared?" Marcus asked. Elise nodded. "And no one ever went down there?" she added, her voice dropping. The implication hung heavy in the air. If Harold had done something terrible, or if something terrible had happened to him, the basement might still bear the evidence. Marcus closed the laptop sharply, as if shutting the screen would erase the memory. "We don't need to know," he said firmly. "We just need to get out." But Elise wasn't convinced. The problem was, neither of them had the money to leave. Moving out wasn't an option, not yet. And worse, Marcus admitted what he had seen, the faint press of fingers in the cracks. Elise listened in horrified silence, but instead of disbelief, her expression hardened with grim understanding. "If he's still down there, if something is, don't you want to know what it is?" she whispered. Marcus shook his head, but Elise's words struck deep. If the basement wasn't just a bad dream, if there was truth beneath the floor, ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. That night, Elise left her laptop open on the table. She had uncovered one more article before bed, one Marcus hadn't yet seen. Granger Street house rumors of cult activity. The clipping was vague, speculative, but neighbors reported gatherings in Harold's basement, strangers arriving at night, never leaving until morning. Some claimed to hear chanting. Others swore they saw shapes in the windows, pale faces where no one should have been. Elise didn't know what to believe. But as she lay in bed beside Marcus, listening to the faint rattle of the basement door again, she couldn't stop her thoughts from circling back to the same idea. Harold hadn't disappeared. He'd never left. Riley ran. She didn't remember unlocking the door or stumbling back across the street. Only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the distant echo of that voice following her through the rain. When she finally made it inside her house, she collapsed by the kitchen table, clutching the photograph she hadn't realized she'd brought with her. The family stared up at her through the cracked glass, their frozen smiles blurred by moisture. She flipped it over again, tracing the words "She never left" with her finger. Something about the handwriting made her stomach twist. It looked familiar. That night, she dreamt of water. Not waves or rain, but still, black water that reflected nothing. In the dream, she was standing in the upstairs hallway of the Henderson house, staring at a door that shouldn't exist. Behind it, she could hear whispering, her own voice, multiplied, layered, saying her name over and over. When she woke, her pillow was damp, her hair matted with sweat. The photograph was lying beside her on the bed, though she was sure she'd left it on the table. And this time, there was something new on the back, faint, as if written in condensation. Come upstairs. She didn't want to go back, but she also couldn't ignore it. By late afternoon, she found herself walking down Birchwood Lane again, drawn by some invisible pull. The house loomed ahead, quiet, almost expectant. The front door stood slightly ajar, as though waiting for her. Inside, the air was colder, heavier than before. Each step on the old wooden floorboards echoed like a heartbeat. The walls seemed to hum softly, a low, vibrating sound that almost resembled a voice. When she reached the foot of the stairs, she hesitated. Riley. The voice was clear this time, not through the TV, not through the static, but in the air itself. A woman's voice, calm and gentle, like someone calling a child home. You've grown, it said softly. I thought you'd forgotten me. The words filled the space between breaths, wrapping around her like fog. She gripped the banister, trembling. Who are you? She whispered. The answer came from the darkness above. You know who I am. And though she couldn't see the woman's face, the recognition hit her like ice water. The voice sounded exactly like her mother's, but Riley's vision blurred. Her mother had died when she was 12, in a car accident no one liked to talk about. Her father had moved them away right after, and they'd never come back to this town. But now, standing in that house, everything began to realign in her memory. Flashes of a younger self on this very street, a woman waving from an upstairs window, the scent of lavender and rain. The woman on the stairs stepped forward, her face slowly coming into view. It wasn't her mother, not exactly. It was something wearing her face, eyes hollow, smile too wide. You left me here, the figure said. You left us both. The next morning, Megan convinced herself she'd overreacted. Cruises had security cameras, trained staff, and plenty of people around. Surely she wasn't in any real danger. Still, as she made her way to the breakfast buffet, she couldn't shake the memory of the slow, deliberate knock on her door. The corridor outside her cabin seemed longer than usual, lined with identical doors that gave no hint of the people behind them. 2 uniformed crew members passed her, speaking softly in a language she didn't recognize. As they walked by, she noticed one of them glancing over his shoulder at her. Not just a quick glance, but a long, assessing look, as though measuring her reaction. Breakfast should have been a comfort. Sunlight pouring through panoramic windows, the clatter of plates, the smell of coffee and fresh pastries. But Megan's attention kept snagging on small details. A waiter refilling water glasses seemed to be lingering at her table just a beat too long. A young couple at the next table whispered rapidly to each other and kept glancing toward the entrance. And when she finally stood to leave, she caught sight of the man from the night before, the one in the dark suit, seated alone near the back. His hands were folded neatly on the table, his plate untouched. He didn't blink when their eyes met. This time, Megan didn't wait to see if he would vanish. She turned and left. She decided to spend the afternoon exploring the ship. Deck 7 had several quiet lounges and a library that smelled faintly of old paper despite the ocean air. In the library, she struck up a brief conversation with an older British woman named Helen, who was knitting in the corner. When Megan mentioned seeing a man in a dark suit, Helen's needles paused mid-click. Tall, thin, doesn't eat? Helen asked, her voice low. I've seen him too. 3 years ago, on this very ship. Different cruise. He was watching people then as well. Before Megan could ask more, another passenger entered, and Helen's demeanor instantly brightened, as if she hadn't said anything at all. That evening, Megan noticed a change in the ship's atmosphere. The wind picked up, rattling the glass doors on the outer decks. The hallways seemed dimmer, shadows stretching farther than they should. She passed a security camera mounted above the stairwell and had the sudden, irrational feeling that it wasn't connected to anything at all. Back in her cabin, She locked the door and tried to distract herself with a movie on the tiny wall-mounted TV. Halfway through, the screen flickered, briefly showing what looked like live footage of the ship's exterior decks at night. In the grainy image, a lone figure stood at the railing, unmoving, staring out at the sea. She shut off the TV, her heart pounding. The ship's engines throbbed beneath her feet, steady and relentless. But she couldn't shake the growing sense that the ocean majesty wasn't just carrying her across the Caribbean. It was carrying something else, something that didn't belong among the living. The boards gave way with a sharp crack, nails skittering across the floor like insects. The door creaked open by itself, exhaling a gust of air so cold it burned Riley's lungs. Inside was darkness, not just absence of light, but something deeper, thicker, as though the space itself refused illumination. She hesitated at the threshold, heart pounding so loud she could hear it echo. Then, from somewhere inside, came the faint sound of humming, a child's lullaby. It was the same tune her mother used to sing her. Flashlight flickered weakly as she stepped inside. The room was small, square, and eerily preserved, a child's bedroom frozen in time. Dusty toys sat arranged in neat rows on a low shelf. A small bed leaned against the far wall, the blanket folded with unnatural precision. But the thing that made Riley's blood run cold was the mirror. It stood across from the door, tall and cracked down the center, draped in a thin layer of gauze. Something moved behind it, not a reflection, but a shadow that didn't match her own. She approached slowly, unable to look away. Her reflection came into focus, the same tired face, same trembling hands. But then, as she drew closer, the mirrored version of herself didn't move. It stood perfectly still, eyes wide and unblinking. A child's voice echoed softly through the room. "I waited for you." Riley froze. The reflection smiled, a slow, too wide smile that didn't belong on her face. "They locked me in here," it whispered. "They said I wasn't real." The air thickened, pressing against her skin. The reflection lifted a hand, pressing its palm against the glass. Riley's own hand rose in sync, but when her fingers touched the surface, it wasn't cold. It was warm. The glass rippled like water, and for a second she saw flashes behind it. Her mother crying, a child screaming, the walls painted with something dark and wet. She saw herself, smaller, curled in the corner of this same room, eyes blank, whispering to someone unseen. And she remembered. This was her room. This was where her mother had locked her away the night everything went wrong. The reflection's voice softened. "You forgot about me," it said. "You gotta grow up. I stayed here." The glass began to splinter, veins of light crawling through the cracks. "But now you came back," it continued, "and I don't have to stay anymore." The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, sending shards flying like silver rain. In their reflection, Riley saw countless versions of herself, some older, some younger, some screaming silently. The last thing she heard before the room went black was her own voice, whispering from the shards. "Now it's your turn." When Riley opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor of the room, but it looked different now. The dust was gone. The air was warm, filled with the smell of lavender and freshly washed sheets. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains. For a moment, she thought she'd dreamed everything. But then she saw the photograph, the same cracked frame lying beside her, and her chest tightened. The family in the picture was the same, but there was something new, a fourth figure standing beside the boy. A little girl. Her voices drifted from downstairs. Familiar ones. A man laughing softly. A woman humming. The sound of a child running across the hardwood floor. Her heart lurched. She stood up, legs shaking, and crept down the stairs. The house was alive again, furniture restored, walls gleaming, the scent of dinner in the air. In the living room, her parents sat on the couch, talking quietly, smiling like they hadn't in years. And on the floor in front of them, a small girl played with a wooden doll, humming that same lullaby. Riley's breath caught in her throat. The child turned, eyes bright and unclouded. "Mommy," she said, but not to the woman on the couch. To her, Riley stumbled back, gripping the railing. The scene wavered, colors flickering like film catching fire. The child's laughter turned hollow, echoing through the house like a broken record. Her parents' faces blurred, then melted into pale, waxy masks. "You remember now," the child said, voice layered, both hers and not hers. You weren't supposed to leave. You promised you'd keep me safe." Riley shook her head, tears streaming. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I was just a kid." The world tilted. The living room stretched and darkened, walls pulsing as if the house itself was breathing. The child stood, the doll dangling from her hand. Her smile faded. "You grew up," she said. "I didn't. I stayed where you left me. I became what you forgot." The air crackled with static. The television flickered on by itself, showing Riley's reflection, not the adult, but the frightened girl from the room upstairs. "You can't run from what's inside you," the voice whispered from the screen. "You never left this house. You never grew up." Riley fell to her knees, covering her ears as the sounds of the house collapsed into chaos. Doors slamming, glass shattering, whispers swelling into screams. The child walked toward her slowly, eyes wide, unblinking. "It's okay," she said, voice soft again. "It's my turn to be real now." She reached out her hand, touching Riley's face. In that moment, everything went silent. The world folded inward. And when the light returned, only one figure remained standing in the living room. A young girl with hollow eyes, humming softly to herself, holding a broken photograph in her small, shaking hands. Morning came quietly to Birchwood Lane, the way it always did. A soft light spilling across cracked sidewalks, dew clinging to overgrown lawns. The house at number 46 stood still, its windows dark, its doors shut tight. For the first time in years, it looked calm. The neighbors who passed by that morning couldn't say why it felt different, only that the air around it seemed lighter, less heavy. And if you stood very still on the corner, you could almost hear the faint sound of a lullaby drifting from somewhere deep inside. Inside, the house had gone to sleep. The furniture was covered in sheets again, the air thick with dust and silence. In the living room, the broken photograph lay face down on the floor. Upstairs, the door to the child's room stood open for the first time in decades. Sunlight pooled across the floorboards, catching the edges of the shattered mirror. And sitting beside it, in the dust, was a small wooden doll, its painted eyes cracked, its smile faded. The house no longer hummed, no longer whispered. It simply waited. Across the street, the diner's morning crowd buzzed with quiet talk. Marlene sat by the window, stirring her coffee. She tried calling Riley 3 times that morning. No answer. Finally, she glanced out at Birchwood Lane, her gaze settling on the house across the way. Something caught her eye, movement in the upstairs window. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, with dark hair and a pale face, standing very still. Marlene frowned. The place was supposed to be empty. But before she could look closer, the child stepped back, vanishing into the shadows. Later that day, when the mailman passed by, he noticed a new name on the rusted mailbox outside number 46. The old "for sale" sign had fallen over in the grass. Written in neat, uneven handwriting were 2 words, Riley Marsh. He didn't think much of it. Just another house changing hands. But if he'd looked closer, he might have seen that the ink was smeared, not with rain, but with fingerprints. Small ones, and so the house slept again, content, with its new keeper inside. Sometimes, on quiet nights, the porch light would flicker to life for a few minutes before going dark. A soft humming would drift from the upstairs window, gentle and childlike. And if you happened to pass Birchwood Lane after midnight, you might swear you saw a little girl standing behind the curtain. Not menacing, not sad, just watching. As though waiting for someone else to come home.